The morning sun barely pierced through the thick smoke that hung over the valley like a death shroud. Captain Sarah Martinez pressed her back against the concrete wall, feeling the vibrations of incoming artillery shells shake the building to its foundation. 340 Marines were now trapped in what had become their tomb, a small outpost in the mountains of Afghanistan that was supposed to be a routine patrol base. It had started as a simple mission. Intelligence reports suggested the area was clear of enemy forces. The Marines had moved in to establish a temporary base while engineers repaired a crucial supply route. But intelligence was wrong. Dead wrong. What they walked into was the largest Taliban ambush in the region's history. Sarah wiped the sweat and dust from her forehead as she surveyed her surroundings. The outpost was nothing more than a collection of hastily built structures surrounded by concrete barriers. It sat in a valley surrounded by towering mountains on all sides, mountains now crawling with enemy fighters who had the high ground advantage. Every escape route was covered by sniper fire and rocket-propelled grenades. The attack had begun at dawn 3 days ago. What started as sporadic gunfire quickly escalated into a coordinated assault involving hundreds of Taliban fighters. They had used the cover of darkness to position themselves on the surrounding ridgelines, effectively creating a killing field with the Marine outpost at the center. Sergeant Mike Torres crawled over to Sarah's position, his uniform torn and stained with blood from a shrapnel wound on his arm. "Captain, we've got wounded piling up in the medical tent," he reported, his voice hoarse from shouting orders over the constant gunfire. "Doc says we're running low on medical supplies and ammunition is getting critical." Sarah nodded grimly. She had been doing the math in her head all morning. At their current rate of fire, they would be out of ammunition within 48 hours. The wounded were mounting by the hour, and their radio calls for evacuation had been met with the same response. Negative. Area too hot for extraction. Hold position. The enemy had planned this perfectly. They knew exactly when the Marines would arrive, how many there would be, and what equipment they carried. Someone had fed them intelligence, and now her Marines were paying the price. The Taliban fighters seemed to have unlimited ammunition and reinforcements, while her force was trapped like fish in a barrel. Lieutenant James Washington, barely 23 years old and on his first deployment, approached with a worried expression. "Ma'am, the men are asking questions. They want to know when help is coming." His voice carried the weight of responsibility far beyond his years. Sarah looked at the young officer, remembering her own first deployment and the fear that came with being responsible for other people's lives. "Tell them help is coming," she said firmly, though she wasn't sure she believed it herself. "We just need to hold the line." But privately, Sarah knew they were in serious trouble. The enemy had them completely surrounded, and conventional rescue operations were impossible. Attack helicopters couldn't get close enough due to the surface-to-air missiles the Taliban had positioned around the valley. Ground reinforcements would have to fight through miles of hostile territory, and by the time they arrived, there might not be anyone left to rescue. As if reading her thoughts, another explosion rocked the outpost. This one was closer than the others, sending chunks of concrete flying through the air. Sarah could hear the screams of wounded Marines and the urgent shouts of medics rushing to help them. The medical tent, marked with a red cross,
should have been off limits according to the rules of war.
But the enemy didn't seem to care about such conventions. Private Rodriguez, barely 19 and still carrying a picture of his girlfriend from back home, stumbled past carrying ammunition to the forward positions. His hands were shaking not from fear but from exhaustion. None of them had slept more than an hour at a time since the siege began. The communication equipment crackled to life, and Sarah grabbed the handset hoping for good news. Instead, she heard the familiar voice of her commanding officer back at the main base. "Sierra 6, this is Command. What's your status?" "Command, we are taking heavy casualties and running low on supplies," Sarah replied, trying to keep the desperation out of her voice. "Request immediate evacuation or reinforcement." The pause on the other end seemed to last forever. Finally, the voice came back. "Sierra 6, understand your situation, but we cannot authorize extraction at this time. The risk is too high. You are ordered to hold position until conditions improve." Sarah stared at the radio in disbelief. Hold position until conditions improve. The conditions were getting worse by the hour, not better. She looked around at her Marines, young men and women who had trusted her to bring them home safely. Some were injured, all were exhausted, and their ammunition was dwindling rapidly. The enemy seemed to sense their weakening position. The attacks were becoming more frequent and more coordinated. They were testing different sections of the perimeter, looking for weak spots. Sarah realized that the Taliban commanders were smart enough to know that time was on their side. They could afford to wait and let the Marines exhaust their resources. As the sun began to set on their third day of siege, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She couldn't wait for official permission or for conditions to improve. Her Marines were dying, and she was the only one who could save them. But first she needed to find a way out of this valley of death, and she needed to do it without getting her entire unit killed in the process. The sound of incoming mortars filled the air again, and Sarah dove for cover as explosions lit up the darkening sky. Somewhere in the distance she could hear the enemy fighters chanting, confident in their victory. But Sarah Martinez was not ready to give up. Not yet, not ever. The fourth day dawned with the acrid smell of gunpowder and burning fuel hanging heavy in the air. Sarah had spent the night moving between positions, checking on her Marines and trying to maintain morale. But she could see it in their eyes, the growing realization that they might not make it home. Some of the younger Marines had stopped talking altogether, while the veterans tried to keep spirits up with dark humor and shared memories. Corporal Jennifer Hayes, a tough combat medic from Texas, approached Sarah with her hands covered in blood. "Captain, we've lost 3 more overnight," she reported quietly. "Johnson didn't make it. Lost too much blood before we could get him stabilized." Her voice was steady, but Sarah could see the pain in her eyes. Hayes had been trying to save lives for 4 straight days with dwindling medical supplies. Sarah felt each loss like a physical blow. These weren't just statistics or casualties of war. These were her people. She knew their names, their families, their dreams for when they got home. Johnson had been planning to propose to his girlfriend when he returned from deployment. Now his family would receive a folded flag instead of a wedding invitation. The ammunition situation had become critical. Sarah had ordered strict fire discipline, allowing Marines to shoot only when they had clear targets. But the enemy seemed to have unlimited supplies, keeping up a steady barrage that forced her Marines to stay pinned down in their defensive positions. Major Rebecca Thompson's voice crackled over the radio from headquarters, 800 miles away in a secure bunker. Sarah had served with Thompson before and respected her tactical knowledge, but she could hear the frustration in her old friend's voice. "Sarah, I've been fighting with the brass all night. They're calling your situation an acceptable loss in the bigger picture of the war." "Acceptable loss?" Sarah's voice rose with anger. "These are Marines, not chess pieces. Every one of these kids has a family waiting for them to come home." "I know that," Thompson replied. "But the generals are looking at numbers. They won't risk losing helicopters and more personnel for a rescue mission with such low probability of success. The enemy has too much firepower positioned around your location." Sarah understood the cold mathematics of military strategy, but she couldn't accept it. Not when she was looking at 19-year-old Private Martinez trying to clean his rifle with shaking hands. Or Sergeant Davis writing what might be his last letter to his wife and 3 children. As if summoned by her thoughts, Sergeant Davis approached her position. At 34, he was one of the older Marines in the unit, a career soldier who had been through multiple deployments. His presence usually had a calming effect on the younger Marines, but today even he looked worried. "Captain, the boys are starting to ask hard questions," he said in his thick Southern accent. "They want to know if we're going to try to break out of here or if we're just going to wait to die." Sarah looked at this man who had become like a father figure to many of the younger Marines. "What do you think, Sergeant? You've been in tight spots before." Davis was quiet for a moment, listening to the distant sound of enemy fighters moving equipment in the mountains around them. "Ma'am, I've never been in anything like this. But I know one thing. These kids trust you to get them home. Whatever you decide, they'll follow." The weight of that trust felt crushing. Sarah had been trained to make life and death decisions, but nothing had prepared her for this. Every option seemed impossible. A breakout attempt would likely result in massive casualties as they tried to fight through superior enemy numbers in difficult terrain. Staying put meant slowly running out of ammunition and medical supplies while the enemy picked them off one by one. Lieutenant Washington appeared at her side, his young face showing the strain of 4 days of combat. "Captain, I've been studying the maps. There might be a way out through the northern ridge. It's steep and dangerous, but it's the least defended approach." Sarah examined the tactical map with Washington, noting the elevation changes and terrain features. The northern route was indeed treacherous, A narrow path along a cliff face that would require the Marines to move in single file while exposed to enemy fire from multiple directions. But it was also the route the enemy would least expect them to take. The wounded can't make that climb, Sarah pointed out, and we'd have to leave most of our heavy equipment behind. I know, ma'am, Washington replied, but it might be our only shot. As they discussed the options, another Marine approached with urgent news. Private Chen, one of their communications specialists, had been monitoring enemy radio traffic. Captain, I've been listening to their chatter. They're planning something big for tonight. Sounds like they're bringing in heavy mortars and maybe even some vehicle-mounted weapons. This changed everything. If the enemy was escalating their firepower, the Marines' defensive position would become completely untenable. Sarah realized she was facing the most important decision of her military career, and possibly the last decision she would ever make. She gathered her senior non-commissioned officers for a quick conference. These were the men and women who would have to execute whatever plan she chose, and she valued their input. Sergeant Davis, Corporal Hayes, Staff Sergeant Williams, and Lieutenant Washington formed a small circle around the tactical map. Here's the situation, Sarah began. Command has essentially written us off. The enemy is planning to overrun us tonight with heavy weapons. We can try to hold this position and hope for a miracle. Or we can attempt a breakout that will probably get a lot of us killed. Staff Sergeant Williams, a quiet man who rarely spoke unless he had something important to say, finally broke his silence. Ma'am, there's a third option. What if some of us create a diversion while others try to escape with the wounded? The suggestion hung in the air like a death sentence. Everyone understood what Williams was proposing. A suicide mission to give others a chance at survival. It was the kind of selfless heroism that Marines were known for, but it was also exactly the kind of sacrifice Sarah was determined to avoid. No, she said firmly. We all go home together or we don't go home at all. I'm not leaving anyone behind. As the sun reached its peak, Sarah made her decision. It was a plan that violated every rule in the military handbook and would probably end her career if she survived. But sometimes she realized doing the right thing meant breaking the rules. Sometimes saving lives meant going rogue. Sarah stared at the encrypted communication device in her hands, knowing that what she was about to do could result in a court-martial if she survived. But as she looked around at her Marines, exhausted, wounded, and running out of hope, she knew there was no choice. Command had abandoned them, so she would have to save them herself. The plan that had been forming in her mind was audacious and probably suicidal. Instead of waiting for official permission that would never come, she would contact someone outside the normal chain of command. Someone who had the resources and the will to attempt an impossible rescue mission. Colonel Marcus Kane was a legend in special operations circles. Sarah had met him during a joint training exercise 2 years earlier, and she remembered his reputation for unconventional tactics and his fierce loyalty to Marines in the field. More importantly, Kane commanded an elite helicopter unit that specialized in high-risk extractions behind enemy lines. If anyone could pull off a rescue in this situation, it would be him. Sarah activated the emergency frequency that Kane had given her during their previous meeting. It was supposed to be used only in the most desperate circumstances, and this certainly qualified. The radio crackled to life, and after several tense minutes, Kane's familiar gravelly voice came through the static. Ghost 6, this is Reaper 1. I've been monitoring the situation. Your command has you listed as a lost cause. Reaper 1, we're not lost yet, Sarah replied, trying to project confidence she didn't feel. But we need extraction within the next 12 hours or we're not going to make it. There was a long pause before Kane responded. Ghost 6, you know what you're asking me to do? This would be an unauthorized mission. If it goes wrong, we're all going to face serious consequences. I understand the risks, Sarah said, but these Marines trusted me to bring them home. I can't let them down. Kane's voice softened slightly. How many wounded do you have? 47 casualties with 12 critical cases that can't be moved easily, Sarah reported. We also have limited ammunition and no heavy weapons left. Another pause. Sarah could almost hear Kane calculating the odds and weighing the risks. Finally, he spoke again. I'll need 6 hours to plan and prep. Can you hold that long? We'll hold, Sarah promised, though she wasn't sure how. After ending the communication with Kane, Sarah faced another difficult decision. She couldn't tell her Marines about the unauthorized rescue attempt, because if it failed, their disappointment might break what little morale they had left. Instead, she would have to keep them fighting without knowing help was coming. Sergeant Davis appeared at her side, having noticed the secret radio conversation. As her senior non-commissioned officer, he had earned the right to know what was happening. "Captain, was that what I think it was?" Sarah looked at this man who had become her most trusted advisor. "I'm going off the grid, Sergeant. Command has written us off, so I'm trying other options." Davis nodded slowly. "You know this could end your career, even if we all make it home." "I'd rather face a court-martial than face the families of these Marines at their funerals," Sarah replied. The enemy attacks intensified as the afternoon wore on, as if they sensed that time was running short. The Taliban fighters had moved closer to the perimeter, using the cover of rocks and destroyed vehicles to advance their positions. Sarah could see them through her binoculars, young men not much older than her own Marines but driven by a different kind of conviction. Corporal Hayes appeared with another casualty report. "Captain, we've got 3 more wounded from that last mortar attack. One of them is Rodriguez, took shrapnel to the chest. I've got him stabilized for now, but he needs real medical attention soon." Sarah remembered Rodriguez's picture of his girlfriend and felt her resolve strengthen. These weren't just soldiers. They were someone's son, someone's brother, someone's future husband. Each one represented dreams and hopes that would be shattered if she failed to get them home. The medical situation was becoming desperate. Hayes had been performing miracles with limited supplies, but even her skills couldn't overcome the lack of proper equipment and medications. The most seriously wounded Marines were being kept alive through sheer willpower and the determination of their fellow Marines who refused to let them give up. As evening approached, Sarah received troubling intelligence from Private Chen, who had been monitoring enemy communications. "Captain, they're definitely planning something major for tonight. I'm hearing references to heavy weapons and coordinated assault from multiple directions." Staff Sergeant Williams, who had been organizing the defensive positions, confirmed Chen's assessment. "Ma'am, we're seeing movement on all sides. They're positioning for what looks like a final push." Sarah realized that Kane's rescue mission and the enemy's final assault were going to happen at roughly the same time. The timing couldn't have been worse, but there was nothing she could do about it now. She would have to trust that Kane's elite pilots could extract her Marines. While under fire from superior enemy forces, Lieutenant Washington approached with a group of younger Marines who had volunteered for the most dangerous assignments. "Captain, whatever happens tonight, we want you to know that we trust your judgment. If you say help is coming, we believe you." Looking at these young faces, some still showing traces of teenage acne beneath the camouflage paint and dust, Sarah felt the full weight of command. These Marines had enlisted to serve their country, but they had ended up trusting her with their lives. That trust was both an honor and a terrible burden. Private Martinez, who had been struggling with fear and exhaustion, straightened his shoulders and saluted. "Ma'am, my weapon is clean and ready. Just tell us what to do." As darkness began to fall over the valley, Sarah could hear the sound of enemy forces moving into position for their final assault. Somewhere in the distance, helicopter engines were spinning up for an unauthorized rescue mission that could save her Marines or get them all killed. She had made her choice to go rogue, and now there was no turning back. The next few hours would determine whether her decision to break protocol would be remembered as heroic leadership or catastrophic insubordination. Either way, Sarah was determined that her Marines would fight with everything they had until the very end. The first helicopters appeared on the horizon, just as the enemy launched their final assault. Sarah felt her heart race as she watched 2 black aircraft flying low through the mountain passes, their rotor blades barely visible against the darkening sky. Colonel Kane had kept his promise, but his timing couldn't have been worse. Explosions erupted around the Marine perimeter as Taliban fighters unleashed everything they had. Mortar rounds, rocket-propelled grenades, and automatic weapons fire created a deadly symphony that echoed off the valley walls. Sarah grabbed her radio and shouted over the noise. "All positions, hold the line. Help is coming." The helicopters were still several minutes away when the enemy breached the outer defensive barrier. Sarah watched in horror as Taliban fighters poured through a gap created by a well-placed explosive charge. Sergeant Davis immediately led a counterattack, rallying Marines who had been on the verge of exhaustion just moments before. "Contact front," Davis yelled, his rifle spitting fire as he engaged the enemy fighters at close range. "Williams, take your squad left. Hayes, get those wounded ready to move. Corporal Hayes was already in motion, organizing a team of Marines to carry the most seriously injured to the improvised landing zone Sarah had designated near the center of the outpost. Private Rodriguez, despite his chest wound, insisted on helping to carry his wounded comrades. The sound of approaching helicopters grew louder, but so did the intensity of enemy fire. Sarah realized that Kane's aircraft would be flying into a hornet's nest of anti-aircraft weapons and ground fire. She needed to clear a path for them, but her Marines were already stretched to their limits. Lieutenant Washington appeared at her side, bleeding from a head wound but still functional. "Captain, the enemy has us surrounded. They're attacking from all directions now." Sarah could see the tactical situation deteriorating rapidly. The enemy had committed everything to this final assault, knowing that if they could overrun the Marine position before the helicopters arrived, the rescue mission would fail. But Sarah had one last card to play. "Washington, take half the men and create a diversion on the eastern side," she ordered. "Make them think we're trying to break out that way. Davis, prepare the wounded for immediate evacuation." The plan was risky. It would leave their main position even more vulnerable, but it might draw enough enemy fire away from the landing zone to give Kane's helicopters a chance. Sarah watched as Washington led his Marines in a desperate charge toward the eastern ridge, drawing heavy fire from that direction. The first helicopter, piloted by Kane himself, swooped into the valley like a giant mechanical bird of prey. Immediately, it came under intense fire from multiple positions. Sarah could see sparks flying from the aircraft's hull as bullets struck home, but Kane continued his approach with the steady nerves of a veteran pilot. "Ghost 6, this is Reaper 1. Kane's voice crackled over the radio. "Landing zone is hot. I repeat, landing zone is extremely hot." "Roger, Reaper 1, Sarah replied. "We'll suppress as much fire as possible." Sarah organized every Marine who could still fight into a protective perimeter around the landing zone. They poured suppressing fire toward the enemy positions, trying to give the helicopters enough cover to land and load wounded Marines. The noise was deafening, a combination of rotor blades, gunfire, and explosions that made communication almost impossible. The first helicopter touched down in a cloud of dust and debris. Immediately, Marines began loading the most critically wounded aboard. Corporal Hayes supervised the evacuation with the efficiency of someone who had trained for this moment her entire career. Rodriguez insisted on being among the last to board despite his serious injuries, but the enemy had realized what was happening. Sarah could see them redirecting their fire toward the helicopters, and she knew they had to move fast. The second aircraft was already taking hits as it approached the landing zone. Staff Sergeant Williams appeared with grim news. "Captain, we've got enemy fighters advancing on 3 sides. Washington's diversion bought us some time, but they're closing in fast." Sarah made a quick calculation. They had loaded about half the wounded Marines, but the remaining aircraft couldn't possibly take everyone in one trip. Someone would have to stay behind to hold the landing zone for a second evacuation, and that someone would probably not survive the night. "Williams, take the next group of wounded and get them aboard," Sarah ordered. "I'll stay with a rear guard to cover the second extraction." Williams looked at her with respect and sadness. "Ma'am, you know there might not be a second extraction. This is probably it." Sarah understood the implications of her decision. By staying behind, she was essentially volunteering for a suicide mission. But she couldn't abandon her Marines, and someone had to coordinate the defense of the landing zone. The second helicopter managed to land, despite taking heavy damage to its tail rotor. Kane's voice came over the radio with urgency. "Ghost 6, my number 2 bird is badly damaged. This is the last trip." Lieutenant Washington returned from his diversion mission with only half the Marines he had taken. His uniform was torn and bloody, but his eyes showed the fierce determination that had kept him fighting for 5 straight days. "Captain, we can't hold them much longer," he reported. "They're massing for a final push." Sarah looked around at the Marines who remained, about 60 men and women who had given everything they had and were prepared to give even more. These were the Marines who would stay behind to ensure their wounded comrades could escape. It was the kind of sacrifice that defined their service. But as she watched the second helicopter struggle to take off with its load of wounded Marines, Sarah heard something that changed everything. The distinctive sound of additional aircraft approaching from the north. Kane had brought reinforcements for a second wave of evacuation, despite the enormous risk to his own unit. All Marines, prepare for final extraction, Sarah shouted over the noise. We're all going home tonight. The battle for survival was entering its final phase, and Sarah realized that her decision to go rogue might actually save every single one of her Marines. 3 more helicopters emerged from the darkness, their pilots pushing their aircraft to the absolute limits as they maneuvered through the deadly crossfire. Colonel Kane had committed his entire squadron to this unauthorized rescue mission, putting his own career and the lives of his air crews on the line to save Marines he had never met. Sarah felt a surge of hope mixed with terror as she realized the magnitude of what Kane was attempting. 6 helicopters total were now operating in a confined valley space while under intense enemy fire. The risk of mid-air collisions was almost as great as the threat from ground-based weapons. Reaper Squadron, this is Reaper 1. Kane's voice cut through the radio chatter. Execute extraction pattern. Alpha, I want birds 3 and 4 to provide close air support while 5 and 6 handle evacuation. 2 of the newly arrived helicopters immediately began strafing runs against enemy positions, their door gunners laying down devastating fire that temporarily suppressed the Taliban assault. The remaining aircraft moved into position to extract the rest of Sarah's Marines. Sergeant Davis organized the final evacuation with the precision of a man who had done this 100 times before, even though none of them had ever experienced anything like this nightmare. First squad, move to bird 3. Second squad, you're on bird 4. Move with purpose, Marines. The enemy commanders had realized this was their last chance to prevent the rescue. Sarah could see them rallying their fighters for one final desperate assault on the landing zone. Hundreds of muzzle flashes lit up the mountainsides as Taliban fighters poured fire into the valley. Lieutenant Washington took a bullet through the shoulder but kept fighting, directing Marines toward the evacuation helicopters while returning fire with his rifle. His radio headset had been shot away, so he was communicating through hand signals and shouted commands. Private Chen, the communications specialist, had been monitoring enemy radio traffic throughout the evacuation. Captain! He yelled over the noise. They're calling for mortar strikes on the landing zone. Incoming in 30 seconds! Sarah felt her blood freeze. Mortar rounds would be devastating to the helicopters and could kill dozens of Marines in the open landing zone. She grabbed her radio and screamed a warning. All aircraft, incoming mortars. Take evasive action. The helicopter pilots reacted with the skill that had made them legendary in special operations circles. 2 aircraft immediately lifted off despite not being fully loaded, while the others maneuvered to present smaller targets. Sarah watched in amazement as one pilot actually flew his helicopter sideways between 2 buildings to avoid the incoming fire. The mortar rounds impacted just seconds later, sending geysers of dirt and shrapnel into the air. One round landed close enough to knock Sarah to the ground, her ears ringing from the concussion. When she looked up, she saw Marines helping each other toward the remaining helicopters, refusing to leave anyone behind. Corporal Hayes appeared beside Sarah, her medical bag slung over her shoulder and her rifle ready. Captain, most of the wounded are aboard, but we've got more casualties from that mortar attack. Sarah could see Marines lying motionless near one of the impact craters. Some were moving weakly, while others weren't moving at all. The evacuation was turning into a race against time, with more Marines getting hit even as others were being rescued. Staff Sergeant Williams had taken command of the perimeter defense, organizing the remaining Marines into overlapping fields of fire to protect the landing zone. Despite being vastly outnumbered, the Marines' superior training and discipline were keeping the enemy from overrunning their position. Williams, Sarah called out. How much longer can we hold? Maybe 5 more minutes, Captain, he replied while reloading his rifle. They're massing for another assault from the south. Sarah looked around at the chaos surrounding her. 2 helicopters were still on the ground, their crews working frantically to load the remaining Marines. Enemy fire was intensifying from all directions, and she could see Taliban fighters advancing under cover of the darkness. One of Kane's aircraft suddenly shuddered and began smoking from its engine compartment. The pilot managed to keep it airborne long enough to clear the landing zone, before making an emergency landing on a narrow ledge halfway up the mountain. Sarah realized that Kane's rescue mission was costing him aircraft and potentially aircrew lives. Reaper 1, this is Ghost 6. Sarah transmitted. You've done enough. Get your birds out of here before you lose more aircraft. Kane's response was immediate and firm. Negative, Ghost 6. We don't leave Marines behind, ever. As if to emphasize his point, Kane's own helicopter swooped back into the landing zone to pick up the Marines near the crash site. Sarah watched in amazement as the veteran pilot maneuvered his aircraft with surgical precision, despite the intense ground fire. Lieutenant Washington stumbled toward her, bleeding from multiple wounds but still functional. "Captain, that's the last of the wounded aboard. Just us and about 20 Marines left." Sarah looked around at the Marines who remained, the ones who had volunteered to stay until the very end to ensure their comrades could escape safely. These were the Marines who exemplified everything their corps stood for: honor, courage, and commitment to each other. But something was wrong. As Sarah counted heads, she realized they had more Marines than helicopter space remaining. The damaged aircraft couldn't carry a full load, and the enemy fire was too intense for multiple trips. Someone was going to be left behind. The realization hit her like a physical blow. After everything they had been through, after Kane's heroic rescue attempt, some of her Marines were still going to die in this valley. Unless she could find a way to buy more time for one final extraction, her decision to go rogue would end in partial failure. As enemy fighters closed in from 3 sides and the last helicopters prepared to depart, Sarah faced the most difficult decision of her life. She could ensure that most of her Marines escaped, or she could risk everything in one final gamble to save them all. Sarah stared at the impossible mathematics of the situation. 23 Marines remained on the ground, but the damaged helicopters could only safely carry 18. In the Corps, there was a sacred principle that no Marine was ever left behind, but reality was about to force her to break that promise. "Captain," Sergeant Davis appeared at her side, having somehow read her thoughts. "I know what you're thinking, and the answer is no. We all go home, or we figure out another way." The remaining Marines had formed a tight defensive circle around the last 2 helicopters. They were down to their final magazines of ammunition, and the enemy was closing in from all sides. Sarah could see Taliban fighters moving through the darkness using destroyed vehicles and rubble for cover as they advanced. Colonel Kane's voice crackled over the radio with frustration. "Go 6, we've got to lift off now. My birds are taking too much damage to stay much longer." Sarah looked at the faces of her Marines, young men and women who had trusted her to bring them home safely. They were exhausted, wounded, and scared, but still fighting with the courage that defined their service. The idea of leaving any of them behind was unacceptable. "Davis, Williams, Washington, gather around," Sarah called to her senior leaders. In the brief moment they had before the next enemy assault, she needed to make the most important tactical decision of her career. "Here's the situation," she said quickly. "We're 5 Marines over capacity for safe extraction. The standard procedure would be for senior personnel to volunteer to stay behind and hold the position." Lieutenant Washington immediately stepped forward. "Ma'am, I volunteer to stay. These Marines are my responsibility too." Staff Sergeant Williams nodded in agreement. "Count me in, Captain. I've been a Marine for 16 years. If this is how it ends, I can live with that." Sarah felt her throat tighten with emotion. These leaders were willing to sacrifice themselves to save their junior Marines, just as she had expected they would. But she had one more desperate plan that might save everyone. "No one's staying behind," she declared firmly. "Davis, how much C4 explosive do we have left?" Davis looked puzzled but answered immediately. "About 6 pounds, ma'am. Why?" Sarah pointed toward the steep mountainside that formed the northern wall of the valley. During their 5 days of siege, she had noticed that the cliff face showed signs of instability, loose rocks and evidence of previous landslides. If they could trigger a controlled avalanche, it might block the main enemy approach route and buy them enough time for a final helicopter to return. "We're going to bring down that cliff face," Sarah explained. "It'll block their main assault route and give us the time we need for one more extraction." William studied the terrain with the eye of an experienced combat engineer. "It might work, Captain, but someone's going to have to place those charges while under fire, and we'd need to time the detonation perfectly." Sarah was already moving toward the explosives cache. "Washington, get on the radio and tell Kane we need one more bird in exactly 10 minutes. Davis, you and I are going to place these charges." The plan was audacious and dangerous. Sarah and Davis would have to cross 50 meters of open ground while under enemy fire, place the explosive charges at the base of the cliff, and then trigger the detonation at precisely the right moment. If they were too early, the avalanche would block the helicopter's approach. Too late, and the enemy would overrun their position. Private Chen volunteered to provide covering fire with the squad's last heavy machine gun. "Captain, I can give you suppressing fire for about 2 minutes before I'm out of ammunition," he reported. Sarah strapped the C4 charges to her combat vest, while Davis prepared the detonators. Around them, the remaining Marines took up final defensive positions, knowing that this desperate gambit was their only chance for survival. "Marines," Sarah called out over the noise of gunfire, "in 2 minutes we're going to make some noise. When that cliff comes down, be ready to move fast to the extraction point." Lieutenant Washington had managed to raise Kane on the radio. "Reaper 1, Ghost 6 needs one final extraction in 10 minutes. "Can you do it?" Kane's reply was immediate. "Roger, Ghost 6. One bird coming back. It better be the last one because I'm running out of aircraft and pilots." Sarah and Davis began their desperate sprint across the open ground toward the cliff face. Immediately, enemy fire erupted from multiple positions. Bullets kicked up dirt around their feet as they ran in a zigzag pattern to make themselves harder targets. Chen opened up with the machine gun, walking his fire across the enemy positions to suppress their shooting. Other Marines joined in with their remaining ammunition, creating a brief but intense barrage that allowed Sarah and Davis to reach the base of the cliff. Working with practiced efficiency, they placed the explosive charges at key structural points along the cliff face. Sarah had studied geology in college before joining the Marines, and she knew exactly where to place the C4 for maximum effect. "Charges set," Davis yelled over the gunfire. 60-second fuse." They triggered the detonators and began running back toward their defensive position. Behind them, the Taliban fighters had realized what was happening and were rushing forward to stop the detonation. Sarah felt bullets whining past her head as she sprinted across the open ground. With 30 seconds left on the fuse, enemy fighters reached the cliff face and began trying to disarm the charges. Sarah's heart pounded as she realized their plan might fail if the Taliban succeeded in removing the explosives. But Private Martinez, despite his earlier chest wound, had crawled to a position where he could cover the charges. With his last magazine of ammunition, he engaged the enemy fighters at point-blank range, keeping them away from the explosives at the cost of his own life. The detonation shook the entire valley. Thousands of tons of rock and debris cascaded down the mountainside, creating a thunderous roar that temporarily drowned out even the sound of gunfire. The avalanche blocked the main enemy approach route exactly as Sarah had planned. In the brief silence that followed, the sound of helicopter rotor blades could be heard approaching from the north. Kane's final aircraft swept into the valley, its pilot threading the needle between the newly created rock barrier and the remaining enemy positions. "Last birds here," Washington shouted. "Everyone aboard now." The remaining 23 Marines rushed toward the helicopter with the desperation of men and women who knew this was their final chance. Some helped carry Martinez's body, refusing to leave their fallen comrade behind even in death. As the helicopter lifted off with its precious cargo, Sarah took one last look at the valley that had been their prison for 5 days. The avalanche had bought them the time they needed, but it had cost Martinez his life. She silently promised that his sacrifice would not be forgotten. Colonel Kane's voice came over the radio one final time. "Ghost 6, this is Reaper 1. All Marines extracted. Mission complete." Sarah closed her eyes and felt tears of relief and grief mixing on her face. They had done the impossible. They had saved every last Marine except for those who had given their lives to save others. But the cost of going rogue was about to become very real. The hospital at Bagram Air Base was a stark contrast to the hell they had escaped. Clean white walls, the smell of antiseptic, and the quiet efficiency of medical professionals working to save lives. Sarah sat in a plastic chair outside the intensive care unit, still wearing her torn and blood-stained uniform, waiting for news about her wounded Marines. Corporal Hayes emerged from one of the treatment rooms, her arm in a sling but her eyes bright with relief. "Captain Rodriguez is going to make it. The doctors say he'll be able to go home to his girlfriend after all." Sarah felt a weight lift from her shoulders. Every Marine who survived was a small victory, a justification for the impossible decision she had made to go rogue. But she knew that the hardest part was yet to come. Colonel Kane appeared in the hospital corridor, looking as exhausted as Sarah felt. His flight suit was torn, and she could see bandages on his hands from flying damaged helicopters through intense combat. When their eyes met, there was an understanding between them that needed no words. "How many did we lose?" Sarah asked quietly. 7 Marines didn't make it, Kane replied. "Martinez died getting those charges set." Johnson passed away from his wounds during transport. 5 others died in the fighting before we arrived. 7 Marines. 7 families who would receive folded flags instead of homecoming hugs. 7 young lives cut short in a war that seemed to have no end. Sarah felt the weight of each loss like a physical pain in her chest. You saved 333 Marines, Kane continued. That's 333 families who will get their kids back. Don't lose sight of that. The next morning, Sarah was summoned to a formal hearing at headquarters. She walked into the conference room knowing that her military career was probably over. Seated around the polished table were generals, colonels, and staff officers who had spent the week analyzing her decision to violate the chain of command. General Patricia Morrison, a stern woman with 30 years of military service, looked up from a thick file folder. Captain Martinez, you stand accused of disobeying direct orders, conducting unauthorized operations, and endangering military personnel. These are serious charges that could result in court-martial and imprisonment. Sarah stood at attention, ready to accept the consequences of her actions. Yes, ma'am. I understand the charges. However, General Morrison continued, we also have testimony from Colonel Kane, statements from your Marines, and a detailed analysis of the tactical situation you faced. The consensus is that your actions, while technically violations of military protocol, saved the lives of hundreds of Marines who would otherwise have died. Major Thompson, Sarah's friend from headquarters, spoke up from her position at the table. Sarah, the official record will show that you followed orders and held your position until a routine extraction could be arranged. Colonel Kane's rescue mission will be classified as a pre-planned operation that was always intended to extract your unit. Sarah felt confused. Ma'am, I don't understand. That's not what happened. General Morrison smiled for the first time since Sarah had entered the room. Captain, sometimes the official record needs to reflect what should have happened rather than what actually happened. Your Marines will receive their medals for heroism under fire. Colonel Kane will be recognized for his exceptional piloting skills, and you will be promoted to major for your outstanding leadership in impossible circumstances. The hearing room fell silent as Sarah processed what she was being told. Instead of facing punishment for going rogue, she was being promoted, and her actions were being officially sanctioned after the fact. The military was covering up her violation of orders because the results had been so successful. There is one condition, General Morrison added. You will never discuss the unauthorized nature of this operation with anyone outside this room. As far as the world is concerned, this was a textbook rescue operation that went exactly according to plan. Sarah felt torn between relief and frustration. She was grateful that her career would continue and that her Marines would be properly recognized for their heroism, but she also felt that the truth was being buried beneath layers of official fiction. 6 months later, Sarah stood before a formation of young Marines at Officer Candidate School, teaching them about leadership under fire. She looked out at their eager faces and wondered which of them would someday face the same impossible choices she had confronted in that valley. Leadership isn't about following rules, she told them. It's about taking care of your people, even when that means making decisions that could end your career. Sometimes doing the right thing means breaking the rules. One young officer candidate raised her hand. Ma'am, what happens if we make the wrong decision? Sarah thought about Martinez, Johnson, and the other Marines who hadn't made it home. She thought about the families who would forever carry the pain of their loss. She thought about the 333 Marines who were alive because she had chosen to go rogue. You live with the consequences, she replied simply, but you never stop trying to bring your people home. After the class, Sarah walked across the base toward her new office. In her desk drawer was a letter from Rodriguez's girlfriend, thanking her for bringing him home safely. Next to it was a photo from Martinez's funeral, showing his family accepting a medal for his heroism. The official records would show that the rescue operation had been a perfectly executed military operation. But Sarah knew the truth, that sometimes saving lives required breaking rules, and that the best leaders were willing to sacrifice their own careers for the Marines under their command. She had gone rogue to save her Marines, and despite the official fiction that now surrounded those events, she knew she would make the same decision again without hesitation, because in the end, bringing Marines home safely was worth any price she might have to pay.